Everybody has their own personal narrative in which they play the part of the protagonist. This very much anchors the conception of self. It informs us of where we came from, who we are as a person, and where we are going. Our best shot in life is to know these things, and for that knowledge to be reflected in material reality, in order that we may properly and accurately navigate in the world. When we find that our material reality does not match up to our expectations, our preconceptions are challenged directly, and we may feel victimized. But what is the victimizer in this case? Some people will inevitably identify one, or many, causes for this failure to accurately perceive reality. It is a form of cognitive dissonance, which is all too common for those focused on their own conception of their ideal selves. If each individual is the protagonist of their own narrative, then what is the antagonist? What is the prime obstacle to the protagonist acting in the world? Many will come up with a laundry list of different possible antagonists. Some will be other individuals. Others will be entities such as groups that are not individual people, and some will be circumstances such as natural disasters, bad luck, or bad timing. But are any of those really true? Could this laundry list contain one's main antagonist, or is the main antagonist of each and every individual also the self? Auto-antagonism. This seems much more plausible. There are a myriad of things that one could do to self-improve if one bothered to take up the task, but most do not. One could make an effort to wake up earlier, go for a run, get some exercise, and read a chapter or two of a book. If someone spent an hour or two each day directly working on self-improvement, after 1 year that person will be markedly distinguishable from the former self. They will be healthier, more self-reflecting, and less prone to suffering. Yet it is rare to see this happening. Why? Well, we, humans, get in our own way. We get lazy, we lack motivation, we lack personal discipline. In a word, we sin against our narrative foundations. But we don't like to admit it, and so externalize our self-victimization and project it onto other people. This projection of victimization is a symptom of cognitive dissonance. Although it is possible to be victimized by forces outside of the self, it is not nearly as common as self-inflicted victimhood. Justice, at least as we conceive of it within our own minds, is completely useless if it is not accurately applied. Improper application of justice, even within our heads, manipulates our objective interpretation of reality, and with each improperly laid justification, we construct a thicker and thicker mental wall, which becomes more and more difficult to ever overcome. We soon discover a perfect paradise within our walls, an imagined Edenic realm where you, the near solipsistic protagonist, are the emperor of truth and righteousness. All contradictions which find their way into these walls, either by clever undermining or through fanciful flights from above, must immediately be smited by your enormity of ego. This sort of response was theorized by Carl Jung to be a response by the self towards the unknown, or at least unexpected, an embodiment of the shadow. The narrative of the self as a protagonist, assuming it lacks the pathology of cognitive dissonance, will universally arrange itself in the following manner. The protagonist exists in the world and faces off against the suffering of being through seeking meaning in his or her life in order to make his or her suffering worthwhile. The biggest obstacle outside of existential suffering is him or herself in the battle to find meaning against it. The self becomes not only the protagonist, but also the antagonist. The battle between that which is good, constructive, and meaningful versus that which is evil, destructive, and meaningless. Too often what happens is, however, that the protagonist externalizes their problems and doesn't face them head on. This logically leads to a poor sense of meaning and self. Contradictions become the diction. Real truth turns into rhetorical device, opinion, and self-propaganda. The protagonist begins to paint an ideal picture of reality, and then gaze upon it, not unlike the prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave, who gaze upon the shadows on the cave wall as if they are reality itself. Only in this situation, it is fully pathological, given that the one doing the projecting is also gazing upon their own creation in an act of narcissistic vanity. as if the protagonist is acting as an antagonist to themselves, which of course was highlighted earlier. The fact of our self-antagonism is self-evident. We need no empirical evidence to prove this, as it is evident in our individual experiences. That being said, plenty of empirical evidence exists. People have problems that could be fixed by a doctor, yet do not seek out a doctor. Even in fiction, this occurs, and can be found in the opening chapter of Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, where the unnamed narrative character describes his health problem to himself and the reader. Quote, "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. However, I know nothing at all about my disease, and do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it. I never have, though I have respect for medicine and doctors. Besides, I am extremely superstitious, sufficiently so to respect medicine. Anyway, I am well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am superstitious. No, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite that you probably will not understand. Well, I understand it though, of course. I can't explain who it is precisely that I am mortifying in this case of my spite. I am perfectly well aware that I cannot pay out the doctors by not consulting them. I know better than anyone that by all this I am only injuring myself and no one else. But still, if I don't consult a doctor, it is from spite. My liver is bad. Well, let it get worse!" End quote. This is a great literary example of self-antagonism. Throughout the novel, the main character wanders about in a chaotic malaise. He likes to pretend he is upstanding and carries in his own mind an air of nobility, but from the perspective of all others viewing him, he is clearly an absolute wretch. He goes about in his self-absorbed, egocentric blindness, readily refuting his noble self-characterizations at any point, rationalizing away any distinct promises made here and there, causing actual pain and suffering to others through their faith in what is so quickly revealed to be rhetoric. He can only view himself as the protagonist in his own narrative. He is so blind to the existence of his Jungian shadow that he does not notice that it has completely enveloped him. The character is of course, entirely fictional. He does not exist. He was never born, nor did he ever die. Yet there are in this world so many exactly like him. Most people are not in his degenerate state, but many could imagine how their own descent into such a state could occur. They imagine it is a real descent into hell, and whether or not they use a religious lens to do so, it is a religious conception. Religious conceptions need not be couched necessarily in religious doctrine. These ideas are human universals, and if nothing else, at least an objective psychological concept with hard reality that people do face. Many fear hell more than they fear death itself, because although death is total oblivion, it is also unconscious. Hell, beyond the religious and spiritual meaning as a place beyond death, can very well exist in real life, where not only are you doomed to suffer, you are doubly damned for having to be conscious of it. This is why it is often scarier to people than death itself, even to atheists. We often hear that Western civilization is in crisis, and that our values are on the brink of death. It is as though Pandora's box has been opened, opponents may say, and all the evils and pathologies and plagues are being wrought upon us. Some opponents even cheer and encourage the death of the West, for both its spiritual and actual destruction. But recall what I wrote earlier. Protagonists favor construction, not deconstruction, or destruction. Protagonists favor diction, not contradiction. That isn't to say that they will not face obstacles along their path, but to say that their path is creative and constructive rather than destructive. It is one thing to destroy obstacles, but another to destroy for the expressed purpose of replacement with a real alternative. The idealist, by definition, never offers a real alternative, but instead an impossible ideal. The logical result is endless destruction. Real communism has never been tried, end quote, being a prime modern example reply to any attack upon the failures of idealistic Marxist attempts. We should pay more attention to the special detail in the Pandora story, however. Despite all of the evils and pathologies escaping into the world to harangue men and women for all of history, hope remains. It is this Pandoran hope that the Jungian shadow which inhibits each individual is realizable and tameable. To master your darker self is to become conscious and accepting of it, so that you may properly direct it. To remain unconscious is to do nothing, other than surrender your consciousness to it. Thomas Aquinas famously said, quote, "If you bring forth that which is within you, it will save you. But if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Such is the nature of the shadow." Secular opinions hold that the existence of religion is best likened as being an aesthetic feature of the human condition, rather than being a condition for the existence of humanity. It is very difficult to draw a line where the condition has been revealed in history, or where we can even know where to find it today. But this condition becomes obvious when you make a comparison to the natural world. That we have a knowledge of our future existence beyond a mere present. We can then know suffering even without the evidence of direct pain, unlike animals which only experience suffering in the form of present pain or directly perceived threat. The difference being that human pain can be differentiated as foreknowledge. Inasmuch as the animal has no foreknowledge, it is incapable of evil or the purposeful application of suffering into other living beings. Humans, however, inasmuch as they are human, do possess the capacity for foreknowledge, which enables us to act in cruel and destructive ways. When a wild animal rips apart your home, assuming they could get in, they would not be doing so out of malice or evil, or purposeful cruelty, but out of complete ignorance. Humans can act in this manner as well, but only if they allow their consciousness to wane in favor of their ever-growing shadow. At some point in this transition from fully conscious to relatively unconscious, they will begin to act in foul ways and rationalize all of it, post hoc. It is as if the self has become divided into a rampaging elephant and an associated emissary, who rationalizes the elephant's actions after the fact. Regardless of what the elephant does, the emissary will be able to rationalize the actions, or at least minimize them in an after-action defense. The emissary seems to be in control of his reason and logic, but he is not. He is totally possessed by the will of the elephant, and at its total and absolute mercy. It is hard to say whether the human being in this position is very much human or not, as they act out the role narratively, but their actions in the world are contradictory. Possessed by this shadow, they become convinced of their own moral righteousness, a corporeal fallen angel taken to flesh, ready to cast judgment on all those who question their solipsistic egoism. The results we see in the world today are called, quote, cancel culture. In George Orwell's 1984, the term, quote, unpersoning. In the medieval Catholicism, we call it, quote, excommunication. Many contemporary and past religious people have said this is a sign that, quote, Satan has taken over. Whether or not you believe that, it appears to bear more truth than any secularist would hope, and should leave even the most ardent atheist questioning their own faith. We, however, have to deal with a current reality. As Nietzsche said, quote, "Where is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." End quote. But what is meant by God in such a formulation? God may be, quote, dead in the sense that many regard the existence of an omnipotent personal being as being ridiculous on its face. But is it truly ridiculous? Another quote from Nietzsche. Quote, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned, as bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" End quote. The proposition being that we may not be worthy of the task we undertook in disinheriting, quote, God from so much previously mysterious natural phenomenon. The gig is up, so to speak, and we are now left with this problem of what to do about a priori meaning and the origins of good and evil. If no prime mover exists who consciously gave us this moral objective framework, then where do we draw it? Nietzsche attempts to address this by asking if we should not become gods ourselves to fill the existentially massive gap, but I think this is incorrect. Perhaps this gap never existed in the first place. Perhaps we created this externalization of a prime mover, when perhaps the prime mover is contained within each individual themselves, through this knowledge of good and evil via our foreknowledge of being suffering. Never have you before witnessed an animal giving prayer to the prime mover for redemption, yet this is found in most healthy human beings. In this conception, quote, the original sin is not merely the act which has has us fall from Eden, but that the fall from bestial bliss, the real Edenic paradise, leaves us with the knowledge of conscious suffering, of which the animal can never know. Within this, quote, sin, we are not human beings at all, but the real sin is being unaware of your real capacity for evil. It is perhaps that we can never return to Eden given our fall that we must be aware. It is that impossibility which some aspire to through their Jungian shadow, a bridge that cannot be crossed, and all attempts that are shrouded in resentment. The realization by the shadow that there is no return to the bestial attempts to undermine the consciousness of the individual, to turn him into an animal through acts of outrageous barbarism. But try as we might, the shadow will fail, and leave only destruction in its wake. Like biblical Cain, who, possessed by such a shadow, destroyed his brother, so that he could not have to live up to it, slaying Abel upon the fields, a bath of blood which could never be washed away, the beaming lighthouse of conscious realization upon a stormy sea of solipsistic egoism, illuminating the real painful suffering of self-realization. Having shaken his fists aimlessly towards the sky, and then onto his ideal, his innocent brother, he is doomed to the reality that he cannot escape his existential suffering, culminating as a lesson to all men and women who will bear it. Again Nietzsche. Quote, when you stare into the abyss stares back into you. End quote. Which is to say, be wary of following inclinations of your Jungian shadow, for you may not be prepared for what follows. It will pursue you forever. Collectivism is an unbalanced idea. Not only is it merely made up of cooperating or enslaved individuals, it often externalizes problems rather than does it deal with the internal issues it faces. This leaves it inherently unstable. When internal problems are blamed on externality, they make violence inevitable, because the resolution is present from the beginning, which is to say, to eliminate the external threat. The collective, to remain in its form, must always present an external threat, otherwise it will lose internal cohesion, as the variant individual actors within the collective begin to sort out their internal differences as a substitute for the greater and more existential externality. Thus, this collective is not only inherently violent, for it does not first seek out its own local problems, but motivated in an absolute sense towards these ends. These ends become the reflexive means for action and maintenance of the collectivity. Any failure to maintain this externality will result in the collapse of the collectivity. The momentum and fumes of past actions against externalities will only last for so long before the counter-momentum of internal division, of competing internal interests, will overcome it. At this point, the collectivity balkanizes, often with great violence, such as in the case of Yugoslavia, which lasted from 1991 to 2001, a conflict which ended with over 130,000 dead and 4 million displaced. Considering the scope and length of this conflict, that many deaths and displacements could be considered a mercy, for it could have been much worse. The ordering principle of collectivism is coercion. You do this, or you are punished. You do that, or you are punished. Why? Quote, because reasons, comrade, for the good of the nation, comrade, etc. Essentially, what occurs is the oppression of the individual, who, by the way, still exists within any collective, but his or her will becomes suppressed by the collectivity, at threat of suffering. It is this threat of suffering that it is in this threat that proof of their humanity remains. The very fact that a collective need threaten an individual with suffering is proof of the nature of the collectivity, and through reference to this current discussion, defines that as evil, an assertion of the shadow. Collectivity, or at least those who wield the threat of coercive force, makes this fallacious assumption that it is responsible for the plenty that individuals within the collective experience. The truth, however, is at least the objective truth, is that they are not responsible for any productivity whatsoever. The individuals within the particular collectivized society are wholly responsible for the associated production within, and this production actually comes out despite the suffocating nature of the coercion they experience from the ideological force wielders. These force-wielding coercive ideologues then resort to rhetoric, opinion, and propaganda to try and convince others that they were responsible for that productivity. But they are wrong, both logically and empirically. They too, the coercive ones, are a contradiction. They idealize themselves as some entity which persists in action for the greater good or the nation, when they only serve themselves. They are in fact pioneering individuals riding the shadow self into plenty. They are no more but bureaucratic robber barons intent on ruthless subjugation of useful idiots for their own individual interests. It is not easy to separate collectivist mentality from individualistic mentality. The objective truth is that only individuals exist. They may associate in groups or collectives, but by that definition, all that a collective is an association of individuals. The collective will does not exist. The general will is an intellectual retreat from the idea of collective will, and does not exist either. The collective will is more akin to a collective of resentment, a feeling of affiliation with a group based on some status, most often victim status, forming their narrative substructure, which is to say that these people feel victim to some externality. The individual, inasmuch as they take personal responsibility for their actions and thoughts, internalizes their victimhood, and deals with their auto-antagonists, in opposition to their auto-protagonists. It is true that sometimes we are victims of externality, but it is by far the vast minority of our being suffering. The vast majority of our problems are internally caused. The focus on that rather small problem creates a knock-on effect that takes us away from our own self and into the realm of collectivity. We blame others for our suffering. We resent their successes, and may even give reason for their success as cause of our failure. We sick our own shadow upon the external world, where it allows us to wreak havoc upon it, upon innocent people, and we turn to ourselves and call it justice. It is clearly unjust to the vast majority of the time. Though these collectivisms or associations of individuals, license is granted to do, quote, socially beneficial justice on behalf of the collective. The resentments are gathered like moral ammunition, with which it targets are destroyed as humans and their life stolen away from them, leaving an empty husk to which the collectivist rejoices in nihilistic bliss and arrogance. Quote, what cost is even a human life in face of my solipsistic ego? Nothing. Let's bring things back into a brighter light. The spirit of Western civilization was built upon three solid foundations. Firstly, via the ancient Greeks, logos, that is to say, the word, discussion, the coming into light of thought and reason. In Christianity, Christ is envisioned as the living embodiment of the logos. Secondly, salvation and redemption. Through the Christian lens, the idea that you are real and capable of error, this defines you as a human being, that you, despite your imperfect humanity, are able to seek out redemption and salvation through Christ, or Logos. Through the interactions of reason, forgiveness, a willingness to be forgiven, and a wish to be redeemed, you can achieve individual liberty, the third supporting leg of Western civilization. That is not to say you are merely free, but individuate from the collective and shadow itself as a center of Logos, able to go about the world to reason and negotiate with fellow individuals, to seek out truth and knowledge, to improve yourself, and by doing so, improve the world and its fundamental infrastructures. It is this journey which reestablishes the underlying narrative substructures of the Western world, and strengthens them against the bitter resentments of being which lay crouched at its borders like a predatory cat. The lighthouse, with its beaming